good afternoon and welcome to Live at the Museum. My name's Penny Vale and I work here at the National Museum of Australia in our lifelong learning team. I would like to start, as always, with an acknowledgement of country. We're filming today on the lands of the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of Canberra. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any and all First Nations people here present and also joining us via the live stream. Which gives me a nice segue into today's program. We're going to be talking about The Message, The Story from the Shore, which is a film that the NMA commissioned from Allison Page and Nick Lush. Yes. Sorry, I always trip over that.
It's harder than an Aboriginal language, actually.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So let me start by introducing my guests today. First up, we have the head of the Indigenous Knowledges Centre here at the National Museum of Australia and our senior Indigenous curator, Margot Neal. Hi, Margot.
Thanks, Penny.
It's lovely to have you back on.
Yes, indeed.
And joining us via live stream, we have one of the film's makers, the lovely Allison Page. Hi, Allison. How are you this morning? Afternoon.
Hi, Penny. Hi, Margot.
Hello, Allison. Good to see you again.
Yes.
All right. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about Allison's beautiful film, The Message, which is part of the Endeavour exhibition that is currently on display at the National Museum of Australia. We will play the film so that everybody at home joining us via the live stream can see the film. Then we will come back to take questions from the audience. So if you do have questions about the film or anything else that you would like to speak to Margot or Allison about, please jump on and enter it. Don't wait until we come back. So please enjoy The Message.
Can I see it?
Wow, terke nawai ngau yang ngai wut ko wona ye bupowe kari nat ngau yang ngai wanda yuratatara. Wow, terke
Mundo bawa walka ngandan ye popo bawa walka ngandan popo bawa wal popo ngandan bawa walka mono ngandan bawa wal.
The message is such a beautiful film, and wrapped up in it in the exhibition, it's quite an experience. Before we go to audience questions, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to throw to Margot and Allison. Allison, I'm going to start with you, but I'd love to hear from you as well, Margot, on this question. How does a project like The Message come to be?
Well, first of all, Penny, I mean, I was lucky enough to be selected by the museum. It was probably one of the most important art commissions I've ever won in my life. You know, basically, I was asked by the museum to work with 4 communities, one on the south coast of New South Wales, at La Perouse, which is my own community, in Cooktown, and up in Bamaga, to tell a story that had never been told before. And that's the story of Cook's voyage from the perspective of those Indigenous people who, more often than not, actually everyone in the film, were direct descendants of the people who encountered Cook. So, I mean, gosh, I was asked to make a film where I'm telling a story no one's ever heard before. It's a story of national significance, and I'm being asked to co-create it with communities that basically get to occupy the skin of their ancestors and relive a story that is incredibly important to them.
Yeah, so from the museum's perspective, how did we go about conceptualising and then getting in contact with Allison?
Well, it was a natural outgrowth of our exhibition of Endeavour 250, because the whole intent of, there's no point doing a Cook exhibition so-called in this era unless you're going to say something new, unless you're going to challenge perceptions, unless you're going to add the other side of history and the other side of story and animate Cook and, again, break down all the stereotypes that go with it, and most of all, telling the story from the shore. And of course, Allison and Nick, the absolute natural fit. They were already occupying the space of sophisticated, evocative, poetic, nuanced storytelling on film that wasn't the drudgery, pedestrian, doco, this is what you should know and this is when you should know. There was none of that, right, as we just evidenced with the film. So it was a natural fit. And of course, Allison and Nick have done a couple of other things for us, so we absolutely know they're a natural fit, and dare I say, probably the only ones in Australia that are capable of dealing with a tough subject beautifully without, grinding it in.
Grinding it is a very
Yes.
evocative idea. Sometimes these things that are a little bit confronting need to be treated with gentleness.
You can't hit people over the head with it. Why? Because it's actually a ripping yarn, and it's got a lot of emotion. It's a human story with a hell of a lot of emotion attached to it. And I think that's why, yes, you could have done a documentary, but you've got to be able to convey that emotion of the voyage, which is something you can't read in Cook's diaries, or you can't even get when you just set out to make a documentary. So a new media artwork was the museum's idea, and I hope that it's just the first of many artistic interventions into this story, actually, because
actually,
it's a story nobody's heard.
Because actually, the exhibition itself is more the documentary. I mean, it's in any good exhibition experience, you pass on information and knowledge and take the visitors into the story, but you've got to have this sensory, inclusive, engaging component, and the combo is what has made the Endeavour 250 an absolute, deadly gangbuster, whatever you call it.
Absolutely. Allison, can I ask, what's the response been like to the film from general audiences, but also from the communities that you worked with in order to create it?
The most outstanding thing, Penny, is that we're all engaging with a story that a lot of us know nothing about. I mean, all of these communities that I've worked with had told their stories in various forms before. I'm not sure that they'd all had the opportunity to tell it together. So as a sort of a linear narrative, that followed both the message travelling north, but also the ship travelling north. So the compendium of those stories coming together, I think, was really interesting, because there was just a lot of commonalities that came out. I mean, I'm an urban Aboriginal. I grew up in South Sydney, right? So I didn't really know that much about our beliefs, our spiritual beliefs around reincarnation, and that we always see that all communities actually saw Cook as the reincarnation of their ancestral totems that had died, gone across the sea, and then come back as a ghost. So for me, and I've talked to communities from WA who have the same beliefs. So for me, it's quite amazing to find out something even deeper about our spiritual beliefs, our religious beliefs, and so there was no way you could have had a meeting of the minds when, they really were like aliens meeting one another, and they had no idea how each other saw one another. There's no way that Cook and Banks would have ever perceived that they were being seen as ghosts.
Yeah, it's quite a stunning thought. Margot, we've talked a little bit about the reception of the film. What's the reception been like to the exhibition itself?
Well, of course, people don't necessarily distinguish because the film is part of the exhibition. But as I said, it is different from the exhibition. It's complementary, same but different. And I think people are quite, for the same reason I said before, they expect to see a film about Captain Cook and Aboriginal people to be about Captain Cook, because that's how it's always been. So just as they're surprised to go into the exhibition and hear another side of the story that they have never heard before, so that is surprising. They've never heard the Indigenous perspective. They've never heard that Aboriginal people in the main who know anything about Captain Cook, especially on that coast, are more positive about him than one would imagine, right? So what happens is it sort of peels off Cook, the metaphor for colonialism and white fellas, to Cook, the man, because Aboriginal people relate to people in that way. And, and I'll get Allison to tell you the fantastic quote. Of all the visitors on the ships in those days who came and called our people the most wretched people on earth and had nothing positive to say about anything, Cook did. And I'm going to let Allison tell you what that quote is in a minute. But overall, it was, I think it was overall the absolute surprise, the absolute a sense of pride and inclusiveness, and I think this film has a lot to do with it. It is so sensorially engaging that, exhibitions generally of this kind do just talk to you, and this more than talks to you, pulls you into the story. So I think people are feeling they need to know more about Australian history that is from the other side, and we all know we haven't had the other side. All us rarefied few here might have, but generally not. So it'll find itself in way into the history books, And everyone's much more, I think, generally more, less guilt-ridden, less negative, less
Yes.
angry once they are included in our story as well. Now, what did Mr. Cook say, Alison? That was just absolutely stunning.
I think Margot's nailed it there. I mean, this, I think, is the start of a whole lot of myth busting around Australian history. You know, Cook is, you know, when I grew up, he was the boogeyman, you know, he's the cause of everything that went wrong. When you interrogate that question and you start to actually see the facts, and that's what this exhibition's all about, is presenting what actually happened. I mean, there were fleeting encounters in 1770, but there was a lot that happened. You know, Cook, when he broke down in Gulbi Yamatha country up in Cooktown, you know, he was there for 48 days. He was sort of getting along pretty well with the locals there, except one day him and his men catch 12 breeding female turtles, like during breeding season, which was just a no-no. And so there was this massive altercation. There was a beautiful moment of reconciliation when the little old man comes forward and breaks the tip off a spear and signals, you know, weapons down. So here we have, on a single day in 1770, an environmental activism happening in Australia. We had this wonderful moment of reconciliation and great leadership and governance happening. I mean, for me, it's no wonder when Cook sailed off the coast of Bamaga, he writes in his diary that Aboriginal people are the happiest people he'd ever witnessed, that the land and sea provides them everything they could ever need. And, you know, it's quite lucid because he goes on and says they don't want our houses, they don't want our clothes, they don't need this, they don't need that. He actually recognised really quite early on, you know, a man from Georgian England, that Aboriginal people were living quite a sustainable and harmonious lifestyle, you know, that was heavily sort of very coherent with nature. I mean, to me, I think that is something that should be taught in schools, and that the man who was obviously from working class England, I mean, he was there on a boat with Banks. Banks had his little puppy dogs. He was the upper class. You know, that sort of class system was in his face. He sort of got it. He sort of got blackfellas, and I think we should give him credit for that.
And before we move off Cook, though, the other interesting thing this exhibition's done that has been noted by lots of visitors is these engaging and intimate moments Cook has had with First Nations people. Now that, you know, overall, not here a long time, big story, goes on for hundreds of years, but the actual period of time in the country was relatively small, but the intimate engagements with Indigenous people and First Nations is something a number of people have commented on. They had no idea.
And that includes Indigenous people.
Oh, it totally includes. We get taught the same story.
100%.
Yep.
You know, I've told this story to some senior Indigenous people that, really knew nothing about it. And I think that's because there was a point in our recent history, in the 90s even, where we weren't allowed to talk about history. If you talked about history and anything negative came up, it was it was the black armband view of history, and you weren't allowed to talk about it. And so what I find really refreshing about where we've come to as a country right now is that we've got the maturity to sort of look at our true history without the lens of the blame game happening there. Because look, the truth of the matter is, and the most striking thing that I've learnt is that, you know, Cook is not the enemy. A lot of decisions were made that affected our lives and our identity as a nation, and they were made by England, and they were probably made by people we know nothing about the 18 years between Cook leaving and the First Fleet arriving. We know nothing about that. And yet everything that happened in that time is affecting our lives still today, affects our identity as Australians. And so I think this is the very, very start of a big journey into our history.
We've we're starting to get some questions coming in from our audiences, both on Facebook and on YouTube. I think you've talked about this a little bit already, Allison, but I imagine that there were more than one surprises that came up. Bob would like to know, did you find anything about the story that surprised you as you were making the story of the message?
Well, I mean, first of all, thanks, Bob. I didn't know anything about the story at all. So, I mean, every single chapter in it was surprising. I found it very surprising that, you know, there was some beautiful stories in the south about these water spouts being around the ship. And that the UN people see that as a sort of a bad omen. That was the very first time the ship had come close to shore at Point Hicks. That was extremely wow to me. And of course, just Cook and Banks being perceived as ghosts all the way up the coast. You know, to me is just, you know, I mean, everybody thinks Game of Thrones is a ripping yarn. I mean, the story of Australia and the origins of modern Australia, where these two cultures came in contact with each other, I mean, it's full of drama.
And Bob clearly has quite a few questions. It's lovely to hear from you, Bob. He would like to know, what was the process of working with community like, and what do you feel that community got out of that process?
Oh, I was really nervous going into it because I had really sleepless nights because I just thought, oh, this is just the most important thing I've ever done in my life. I really can't stuff this up. I really have to honour exactly what the community want, while at the same time make an artwork that's coherent, you know, because too many cooks can spoil the broth, right?
Margot.
Sorry about the pun there, but
that's all right. It's one of my titles.
No, but that was not a problem at all. Like, it was just completely natural to go. I mean, look, to work with Michael Solomon and his guys up at Bamaga, which is in the final scene of the film. I mean, it's like they'd been rehearsing it their whole lives, because it was just a one-take wonder. You know, we went in there and we sort of discussed what we were going to do and how we were going to do it, and what the sort of chapter in the story should sort of convey. But it was like, but they were sort of like telling me the words, finishing my sentences. I mean, it was really like that. And, you know, I've worked with communities for over 20 years, and you very rarely get that sort of creative synergy with that many people, 50 people. You know, I had to work with 50 people in this film, you know. So, and the consultation, it was extremely important. Never before has it been so important to have that sort of cultural authority, I think.
On the cultural note, Motria, I hope I'm getting your name right, would like to know which language groups are represented in the film.
Well, we've got the Yuin people down on the south coast, and we've got the Weigel people in Botany Bay, and that's in my community. I've got connections down in Yuin country as well. And the Gulguyamata people in Cooktown, and the Kororog up in Bamaga, who are the Aboriginal people that just on the Australian side of the Torres Strait.
And we have a question from the studio, which means one of my colleagues. Was it as beautiful to make as it was to watch?
Look, when I was in my studio trying to work out the logistics around the Australian bushfires, no, it wasn't. It was a nightmare. You know, it was a logistical nightmare. And, you know, it was kind of funny because, you know, we sort of had, we got most of the production into a window between the bushfires and COVID. So, you know, in a lot of ways I have to look back at it all and say that we were blessed that we got it into that winter, really. But yeah, certainly the bushfires were hampering our efforts late last year, 100%. And but you know, when we got to Cooktown, I must say, you know, like there's so the whole like I felt like the whole town was there, you know, like you know, the mayor would come down and help cook, you know, like it was that kind of like vibe in Cooktown. So they were absolutely a pleasure to kind of work with in that sense. You just don't get that in normal filmmaking. It was fantastic.
We have a question from Katrina on Facebook. This one is for Margot. What is the future for the film after this exhibition?
Oh, Cairns, of course. New York.
Did you say Cairns? Cairns in Queensland?
No, in Cairns. Cairns. I'm sorry, I got the wrong accent. Cairns. Well, why not? Yeah, well, we haven't thought about its future, although I would, one of its futures, many futures, never one of anything. I reckon one of its futures is that it will have a permanent residence in the Gallery of First Australians. So it'll be the way one talks about colonisation, Cook and that particular year. So as Allison said, it's a great opener. It's a great opening conversation. It's new and sophisticated, elegant, and makes everyone who sees it want to know more. So that'd certainly be one of its places. And Allison might have some other ideas after New York.
Look, you know, I think it's year 3 or 4 that I can't remember. I think it's year 4 because I went and spoke about this story to my son's year 4 class. That's where they learn about Captain
Schools.
Cook. And you know, I told this story and I said, look, this is hot off the press. You know, no one's heard this before. And you know, there were like. The whole audience was gasping, you know, especially when they found out 12 female turtles had been killed.
Yeah.
And, you know, so for me, my hope is that, you know, every child gets to learn about this, gets to see this film when they're learning about Captain Cook.
Yeah,
Really?
in the school curriculum.
Yeah,
It definitely
100%,
find
yeah.
its way into the school curriculum.
Yeah, and that maybe there's aspects of this exhibition that can be sort of digitised and, you know, put in a textbook, you know, really a new textbook, because, you know, my history book when I was at school, I'm 46, and, you know, you'd open up Australian history and it'd say, in 1770, and it started there, which drove you crazy. So I just sort of hope now that we have realised that we're not young and free, we're one and free, and that we have a beginnings to this country that is thousands and thousands of years old, that our history books would be a lot thicker and they would have a lot more stories of cultural nature that frankly are more interesting.
We have a question coming in from Tom via YouTube. Who contributed to the narrative from the viewpoint of Cook and his crew? How did you engage with that kind of research, Allison?
Well, we have amazing curators at the museum that we worked with. You know, one of the first things they did was give me Cook's diaries to read, and had actually taken out all of the, you know, highlighted the areas where he referred to Indigenous people. Because ultimately, you know, this is about where these two stories intersect. Yeah, that was really, really important, because obviously I had to break down my own perceptions about Cook and learn more about the man. You know, I couldn't have made this film unless I had sort of immersed myself in the story from the ship as well as the shore. And I think then that's really, in great filmmaking, you have a counterpoint. So you always have sort of two kind of opposing sort of narratives happening. And so, yeah, it was really incumbent on me to sort of, to find out where those two viewpoints were really.
Wendy via Facebook, I'm going to throw this one to Margot at least initially, would like to know why Cook declared Terra nullius on Australia.
Well, perhaps I better ask him. We'll check his diaries. Well, obviously.
I actually don't think he did.
We're not sure,
My
actually.
understanding is that he didn't.
No.
He didn't declare. He didn't say that at all. I think Banks may have planted the seeds of Terra nullius in his diaries, which referred to the country as sparsely inhabited. The native people were quite savage. You know, I think he'd sort of laid the groundwork, and that's what I was talking about with those 18 years between Cook leaving and the first fleet arriving. I mean, there was obviously some quite deep conversations that went on, you know, in the palaces, you know, in England about Australia, because the War of Independence had ended in America. They had to stop sending prisoners over to England, and so they needed a new offshore detention centre, and they turned their sights to us. And I think it was very convenient to really sort of start talking about this country as no man's land from that point on.
So that's a myth worth dissolving. It wasn't Cook who declared it.
Bob again, hi, lovely to hear from you. Would like to know how has your view on Cook and his voyage changed after making the message? I think you've addressed this kind of tangentially, but it'd be great to sort of talk a little bit more about that.
Well, look, there's no doubt that Cook's voyage was the catalyst that changed the course of history for Indigenous people in Australia. It's amazing to think that he would have left, and you know, and the blackfellas would have sort of gone, oh well, that's the end of that, excellent, you know, and even had 18 years of, you know, paradise again. Really, I mean, they would have had no view of what was to come. But I think to kind of lump, you know, they're two very different parts of our history, Cook's voyage and the First Fleet. So for me, I'm extremely, that's much more clearer to me now, but also I'm extremely passionate about finding out more now about 1788, especially now that we've just had Australia Day. I'm just extremely, there's so much about that is covered in mythology as well. I mean, if you don't know your history, then you will start creating your own narratives, and I think we're guilty of that in Australia. That we've just created a whole lot of myths and made up our own sort of stories in relation to these parts of our history. So the more clarity we can get around them, I think the better for us, because it's not our fault. You know, and as Margot said, you know, guilt is a useless emotion. So we've got to sort of take that useless emotion out of the debate, you know, and talk about the date.
Because actually guilt enacted is the worst form of racism, actually. You know, it's just, if that's where you're coming from, then we go nowhere, which is what's happening. Thanks, Allison, that's a good point, yeah.
We're getting some really beautiful comments through on YouTube and on Facebook as well. So thank you to everybody who is commenting and engaging. It's always really lovely to see people engaged with it. Marco from Facebook would like to know, are there plans to do more from the shore perspectives from other historical milestones? Allison, is this where you jump off into many more films?
No, this is where I'd love to cut to Scott Morrison, who's going to make a big announcement about some huge levels of funding that he's going to put into Australia's history. Look, I'm not joking. I actually have been, you know, behind the scenes, you know, lobbying ministers just for that very fact. I mean, you know, it will just have such important nation building you know, potential for us. I mean, the Australian identity is not exactly clear. It's not exactly very well drafted, I don't think. There's not a lot to hang on to for young people, whereas if you could start teaching these stories about the fact that we come from the most sustainable, most beautiful culture built on traditional knowledge, traditional ecological and harmonious knowledge, amazing, you know, which is Margot's area of expertise. if you can sort of say that, have children kind of sprouting that as something that's extremely important. And even when these stories connected, we found a way to sort of celebrate the best of both worlds, really. It's as if we're all standing on the beach with Cook right now and we're having a meeting of the minds. We're having the conversation that should have been had in 1770. Well, we're all there now and we have this chance to define ourselves as a nation.
That's a fantastic way of looking at the shared history and a way of moving forward. We have a question from Facebook. Michael would like to know, do you see filmmaking as a new genre of storytelling for First Nation stories, or an extension of a very old storytelling tradition?
Oh, Margot, you've got to take this. I mean, this is yours.
All right.
Sorry, but this, you know, the stories being written in the land is Margot Neal's expertise.
We don't even have to go over the fact that storytelling is how we pass on our knowledges, you know, in a non-text-based society. So in a non-text-based society, we've explored the performative, the movement, even the in the cave, like Cave Hill, Wallinga, just the flickering flames against bodies and animating the images on the wall was our first cinema in this country, or in the world actually, might I say. So that was our first cinema, the performative, and the fact that often this happens with dots and stripes on the body in firelight means it is strobic, it is animated, it is filmmaking. So, you know, storytelling is a given, we've all heard about that, but I don't think people quite get that the actual cinematographic quality of storytelling existed around the fires in the caves and bodies, you know, millennia ago. But it's right, our story's written in the land, and you just need to know how to read it.
Yeah, and I think the difference is that, you know, cinema in a Western context is really about entertainment. So it's a very passive role that the audience plays, whereas in Aboriginal storytelling, the audience member is the key to activating the knowledge. Yeah. They are the key to understanding the knowledge, absorbing the knowledge, and then passing the knowledge on. And they may choose other forms in which to, whether they make their own films or whether they make their own. You know, I mean, I started out in architecture, so I was telling stories in the built environment. And I really don't see, I think the digital medium is really powerful in terms of its emotion. I think you can get more emotion out of a piece of cinema than you can out of a piece of architecture, frankly. But but I still think that, you know, it's really, you know, part of a very long Australian tradition to be embedding our stories into all landscapes, whether they be those modern interiors of the museum or the Australian bush. And that, you know, I think with our phones and things like that and augmented reality and things like that, we can actually start to bring these songlines to life.
Australia Day?
We are coming to the end of our program. If we don't get to your questions, sorry, this is for those of you who are joining us online. If we don't get to your questions, we will respond in text afterwards. So particularly on YouTube, make sure that they are comments on the YouTube video, not just the live stream, because if they're just on the live stream, we will lose them. We'll try and get to another couple of questions. I think one of the last ones we might get to, Allison, I think, talking about your journey from architecture to film. Amanda would like to know what inspired you to become a filmmaker. That's via Facebook.
Well, yeah, I think it was, you know, probably getting more interested in the storytelling aspect of my practice, which, you know, when you're making sort of buildings and things like that, I mean, the process can be quite long, and the storytelling aspect of it is such a small part in the big kind of creative scheme, whereas filmmaking is extremely intense. It's emotional. It involves deep and connected relationships with a lot of people very quickly. You sort of jump into community and you're really in there and you're making something special together. I just think I love that. Anyone who knows me, and Margot knows me well, that sort of level of intense relationship is what I'm really into. Especially when you're making art together as well. I mean, it's a wonderful career. I started doing it 6 years ago, and frankly, I wish I had started doing it 26 years ago. So I always say to young people, you know, if you want to travel, meet new people, have intense creative relationships with people in exotic places, then get into filmmaking. It's a wonderful medium. And I think, you know, for me, I'd love to see more Indigenous films because there's just such a breadth and depth of really out there stories. I mean, look at the Seven Sisters Dreaming, Margot. You know, it's got it all.
All right, I am starting to get the wrap up from the studio here, so I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to close out the program with. The first one I'm going to address to Allison. Do you have a central theme to your work that you'd like Australians and the broader international community to take away?
Oh, absolutely. It's, for me, I think we've always, Indigenous people have always told stories in a way so that they're embedding traditional knowledge. They're sort of pointing the way at a whole depth and breadth of ecological knowledge. So for me, that's sort of one aspect of it. I suppose the central theme to my work is about where these stories of indigeneity and, you know, the Western culture kind of intersect. It's at those sort of nodes where I just find, you know, like what are those, it's not enough to just sort of tell ancient stories, like what is the relevance today? How can we kind of make this story feel like it's belongs to a new Australian or belongs to, you know, an immigrant from England, and to kind of, if you can kind of bring those stories right into their hearts and let them own it, I sort of feel like it really contributing to the Australian identity, really, which is what I'm into.
Thank you so much. That's a really fabulous explanation of the message and your work in a wider context. Margot, before we wrap up, I would love to hear a little bit, or a lot, depending on how much time we have, on what drives your work, because you've been in the museum for quite a while and it's very often seen as quite a traditionally colonial kind of institution. So you're in here and you're decolonising some of what we do. So what drives that work?
Well, Allison and I are pretty well on the same page, and so I can just follow on what Allison said, and she's referenced a few things, and we have other joint projects, and we are on the same page because both of us have a very positive view of where we're going next. We're into truth-telling. We're not into denying anything that happened before. So all the exhibitions and the books and the things I do here have always been driven for the last, well, even before I came in, when I was in the art galleries, is always driven by the fact that we are all Australians, and this, unless we get away from the them and us into sharing the story, sharing the history, that means all the responsibilities that go with this, not just the joy of it, but sharing the past, sharing the future, because we are living on a shared continent. So until we're all different, and so different parts of the story, there's no problem with that. It doesn't mean assimilation. But what it means, I think, is best put in the last Songlines exhibition by, you know, sort of the conversations with the elders and what we came out with. I've quoted before and I'll quote it many more times, is that, you know, is if you live in this, say, the Aboriginal elders are saying to the rest of the audiences, that means city blacks and, you know, white fellas, if you're going to live in this continent, you're going to know your stories more than the past 240 years, or you'll never belong. You'll never feel you have any responsibility for saving the songlines, for saving anything, unless you know your stories from way back since the creation of the continent. And Aboriginal people like them and others are here to tell these, so not share them, tell you your own story, right? This is your story. So until that, as Allison just said, until that ownership stuff takes hold, it'll always be them and us, and our mob did the bad thing by you mob, so we'll bleed our hearts all over you and suffocate you with guilt and, you know, all that sort of stuff is just insane. You know,
because
so,
in relation to history, the things that happen to Aboriginal people, they are the nation's scars. They belong to all of us. They're all of our wounds for all of us to be a part of healing.
So that's pretty well where we're at. Just before we stop, I reckon we should talk about how the message actually is a kind of portal of sorts for Australia Day. Alison.
Well, yeah, look, just coming off the back of that, you know, if you sort of believe that that history is important and that we should never shy away from it, then, you know, I think I would never change the date. I would redesign the way that we spend Australia Day. If it's a day to just go and have a picnic and get drunk, then yeah, you should change the date. It's not appropriate. But I think that we're mature enough to have a morning of mourning, to recognise our history, to really talk about it. You've got an audience of 25 million people that are waiting to hear about the significance of this day. So we must harness that opportunity. We must tell that story, and then we can hold hands together and celebrate in the afternoon, because I think, you know, it's time.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Allison. It's been really lovely to talk to you and to hear your thoughts around The Message, which is a film that I have really enjoyed, and the sensory experience of it in the Endeavour exhibition is quite glorious. The Endeavour exhibition is still on display here at the National Museum until the end of April, I believe. For those of you who are not in Canberra and cannot make it to the exhibition, a lot of the exhibition is online. The exhibition catalogue also is available through the NMA's web store. So if you're interested in doing a bit of a deep dive into this exhibition, that is definitely a great thing to check out. Our next Live at the Museum will be on Thursday, the 25th of February. We're going to be joined by Chrissy Goldrick, who's the Editor-in-Chief of Australian Geographic, and photographer Francis Mochnik, to discuss the Portrait of Australia book and exhibition. The exhibition features photographs from the Australian Geographic Archive that celebrate the bush, the outback and the coast, and they go back something like 30 years. It's a very beautiful exhibition, currently on display in the National Museum's Studio Gallery. So once again, Allison, thank you so much for joining us. It was so lovely to have you.
I agree.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much also, Margot, for joining us.
There'll be more films of Allison's coming our way, by the way, so just bated breath.
Sneak preview.
So as you know.
And thank you everybody who joined us on Facebook and on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, you may want to subscribe to our channel. If you're on Facebook, you may want to just ensure that live notifications are enabled so that you see all of these programs as they go out. And we will see you again in February. Thanks so much.
Thank you.